Okay, I promise not to read the whole presentation, but I'm going to start out with some things that I really want to convey, which means I have to write them down. As Carol said, I'm a cowboy bootmaker, and as a cowboy bootmaker, one of my responsibilities is to teach. Cowboy bootmaking is a historic craft, and it's a uniquely American craft, but it's an obscure and little-known craft. It's been passed along orally from maker to apprentice, and there's very little written information or documentation about the craft of cowboy bootmaking. Because of this, it hasn't really been studied or documented. Bootmakers don't win awards or become famous, at least not yet. And an exhibit about cowboy boots or cowboy bootmakers is rare. So thank you to Otis College and Craft in America. This is why I said stand before you today, but I guess I get to sit. This is why I'm here in front today. It's my duty to pass along this knowledge to my students, and it's my privilege to share with you today and tell you about my life as a cowboy bootmaker. Here's my social media information if you're interested in following me. So the most common question that I get is, how did you get into this craft? Did your father or grandfather teach you? And the answer would be no. I was raised in a very conservative little home, in a very conservative little church where the ladies all wore long hair and long dresses. This is me. We played outside. This is me at about age 10 with my family. So as a rule, we made those dresses. This was actually a bridesmaid's dress for a cousin's wedding. This is how we dressed. So when I was 20, my husband and I married and moved from Missouri to Oklahoma, and I answered this ad in the newspaper, looking for someone to stitch boot tops. I had no idea what that meant, and I'd never worn a pair of cowboy boots. Jay Griffith was a grumpy old alcoholic, and I'd never been around anyone who cussed or drank. It was quite an education, and I used to go hide in the bathroom and cry. But bootmaking appealed to me because in the church where I was raised, girls did girl things and boys did boy things. And boy things was building things and playing outside, and girl things was cleaning up after boys, basically. And so bootmaking combined those things. I got to explore my artistic side. I got to sew things because I did enjoy sewing. The only thing I hated about sewing was it was a girl thing, and I didn't like fulfilling that expectation. But cowboy boots also allowed me to hammer and build things, and I loved that aspect of it. Before I go farther, I forgot to tell you, I love questions. So feel free to jump in, ask a question, raise your hand, wave it around, whatever. I don't mind being interrupted with a question. When I worked for Jay, my job was stitching boot tops, as I said. This was on a vintage sewing machine. There's no computer, it's just me sewing. And I was an employee for Jay, which means that he taught me to do my job, and I got paid to do that job. He did not teach me to make cowboy boots because he was paying me as an employee. I worked for Jay for a year and a half, stitching boot tops just like this. A typical boot is 2 front panels and 2 back panels. So 4 panels, all the same. And that's what I did for Jay. And after I left Jay, in an attempt to stay in the business, I stitched boot tops for bootmakers across the country. They would send me all 4 panels. I would do the decorative stitching and send them back. It was typically things like this, just very plain. 2, 4, 6 rows of stitching. And that's done 1 row at a time. The most I've ever done, I think, is 20 rows. When you're doing multi-row stitching like this, then obviously the first row needs to be precise, and after that you're just guiding off the previous row. The thing is, once you get into multiple rows, let's say on row 10, you're not only watching row 9, you're also watching row 1, so that 10 rows stays uniformly a 1/2 inch wide and doesn't do this throughout the pattern. Another interesting thing about me is these machines have a knee or a foot lift. So to raise the presser foot, which you do a lot because there's lots of points. So you're going up to a point, pivot, lift, pivot, lift, pivot. And these machines have a knee or a foot lift. And I very quickly discovered at Jay's that my right foot was pushing the pedal, raising the lift, pushing the pedal, raising the lift. And I thought, this isn't efficient. And I taught myself to sew with my left foot. It was a little uncertain at first, but I can now stitch equally well with either foot. I'm proud of that skill. I'm going to go through a brief overview of how a cowboy boot is constructed. It starts with the last. Bootmakers have a saying, the last comes first. So the last is a wooden or a plastic form. It's not shaped like a foot. It's shaped like a boot or a shoe. So every boot or shoe is built around a last, and a last accommodates a foot. This is a cowboy boot last with an 1 3/4 heel. I couldn't make a cowboy boot with a 1-inch heel on this. I couldn't make a lady's 3-inch pump on this. It's a cowboy boot last. So if you want to make boots or shoes, you have to have the appropriate last for the footwear that you're making. This is a vintage last from the 1940s, and those are my favorites, but the last of today are usually plastic. So here's the plastic last. I started a company about 5 years ago where I sell leather tools and supplies to other boot and shoe makers across the world. It grew very quickly because there's not a lot of places to buy these tools and supplies. And I not only use these lasts, I also sell them. This is a book that I've written about working with leather and creating art with leather. The biggest mistake I made on the cover of this book was allowing them to put a cowboy boot on the cover, because it gives you the impression that it's a book about cowboy boots or that it's a book about how to make cowboy boots, and it is not. It's a book about creating art with leather, because what you'll see as we go through the slideshow is art on cowboy boot tops. I create art with leather inlay and overlay, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But the thing is, it could be separated out of cowboy boot making. You could use these techniques on handbags or jackets or actual art pieces, but no one knows how to create art with leather because it hasn't been documented. No one talks about it. There aren't books about it. It can be very disorienting for people coming into the craft. Their first question is always, where are the videos? Where are the books? Where's the YouTube? And there really aren't. I have a YouTube channel, but it's hard to find information about this craft. It's been passed along from master to student. This is an example of how I would work with a customer starting out. I met her at a show, I measured her foot and got her on file, and after that we're able to work remotely. So I've sent her pieces of leather for her to choose, what color do you want the bluebird, what color do you want the butterfly, and she can see what the leather choices are. This is something that I've put on social media to show everyone, here's the pattern that I'll be working on next, and here are the colors that I'm going to be using. The pattern is created on a piece of poster board. This pattern actually has 2 pieces of information for me. So the shape and size of this piece of poster board shows me or dictates the size of the boot that I'll be making. But the design on it is going to guide me through the design process. And typically, a cowboy boot pattern is symmetrical. So I've folded this pattern in half and stitched it with no thread in the needle. I open it up, and now I've created the pattern on both sides. If a pattern isn't symmetrical, then obviously I don't fold it. You'll see most of the designs that you see will be symmetrical because that's very common for cowboy boots. You'll also notice that the design area that I'm working with is kind of an H. You've got the boot tongue coming up from the bottom and the scallop coming down from the top, and that leaves you 2 bands on each side and a smaller area in the middle. I'm accustomed to working with kind of an H shape. And flowers and butterflies and sometimes eagles with their spread wings work well in that H shape. That's why flowers and butterflies are really common themes and traditional themes for cowboy boots. They're not feminine, they're traditional themes. More flowers and butterflies. Now I'm beginning to cut the pieces. Every piece of leather has to be skived or thinned at the edge at an angle so that when I join the pieces, they don't form bumps and ridges. If you're accustomed to working with fabric, it doesn't really form those bumps and ridges, but your issue with fabric is fraying. So you have to sew the seam together and fold something in so the edges are concealed and they don't fray. If you're working with wood, doing marquetry, then you create like puzzle pieces and slot them together. But leather has to extend under. And because of that, you want to skive those edges or thin them so that you don't feel those bumps and ridges where they've joined. I actually enjoy skiving. I can spend hours skiving. It's like meditation, but it takes a long time to learn to be a good skiver.
Do you do it with a special tool?
Yes, there's an example right there. That's my skiving knife. And I like this.
Sort of like an X-Acto knife?
Yes. I have used X-Acto knives. Sometimes for classes I'll use X-Acto knives because then we can just throw away the blades and not sharpen them. But I prefer this knife, and I like the fact that you can see there's a lot of knife to hold, but the actual sharpened blade is only a very small area. It's easy to sharpen because there's such a small area, and I'm only using the tip of it anyway, so I don't really need a huge knife. I was taught to skive with a knife that's about this long, and it's flexible, so you bend it and that's how you create the skive, but it's really hard to get something this long sharp the whole way, or at least it is for me.
So you're just scraping away? With the tools that
It's not really scraping, it's a slice. If you're a good skiver, if you've got an 18-inch strip of leather, you can skive off an 18-inch strip of like a tiny little leather wedge. Sometimes with students, I accuse them of fuzzing, which is where they're kind of like scrape, scrape, scrape. That's not skiving. This is a lot of tiny little pieces that will come together to form a boot. In a few slides down, you'll see a very patriotic boot. You'll notice it. And so these are the pieces. So like those red stripes are stripes for a flag. The blue pieces over here have little stars punched in them. That's the blue part of the flag. You can see some eagle's wings. If you take a good look at these pieces in a minute, you'll recognize some of them. Here's a really good example of a piece that's been skived. Those lighter edges are because I've sliced off the leather at an angle. This is narrow skiving. If you're doing a part that goes over, you want a very narrow skive because you're going to be stitching right along that edge. And you want to be stitching through full or almost full thickness of leather so it doesn't tear, but at the same time it does need to be skived. Now if it goes under, you want a very wide skive so it can just blend in and you don't have to worry about it tearing because it's underneath. That is the back side of the leather, yes.
So then on the piece that you'll be putting on there, you skive on the finished side?
No, I'm still skiving on the back side.
Oh, okay.
The only reason I would skive the finished side off is if I'm doing rough out. So I don't work with suede, I work with rough out, which was just the back side of the leather. And sometimes I'll work with rough out just because it's a slightly different color. Because with leather, I don't tan and dye these skins. I buy the colors that are available to me. And just because I want a different shade of green doesn't mean I'll ever get it. And one of the ways that you can expand your color palette is just look at the backside and see how you like it.
So why don't you use suede?
Suede is typically a split, so it's not good leather. All of the decorative stuff that you see today is kangaroo leather. So this is kangaroo leather. Kangaroo leather is very thin, but it's also strong. It's ideal for leather inlay and overlay because it doesn't build up and get bulky. I don't use too many strange animals. I work with kangaroo, alligator, and kangaroo, alligator, and ostrich. Most leathers, especially the ones I use, leather is a byproduct of the meat industry. You don't kill animals for leather, you kill them for meat. So if we all become vegetarians, there's no more leather, as a rule. Which I'm okay with that, but until that happens, leather is a waste product or it's made into, or it needs to be used and made into leather.
Very interesting.
Kangaroo leather is wonderful. It's really my favorite to work with. Other than the soles and heels, I'm not working with vegetable tan leather. Vegetable tan leather usually has more of a muted color if it's colored, and I tend to work with chrome tan. This is just a close-up of the leather inlay and overlay and the stitching that I've done. Again, the stitching is done one row at a time on a Singer sewing machine from 1945. There's no computer. This is not the Patriotic boot. It will come along later, but it's similar. You'll notice that the eagles are facing the same direction. Typically, if you have an animal figure, you would reverse one so that they face each other on the boot tops, or if you have some sort of mirrored item, you reverse them. But this is the eagle from the United States seal, and it cannot be reversed. This just shows you an example of the one on the left has not been stitched, and the one on the right has been stitched. And you can see how it just pulls out all those details and adds interest. With leather, because you're working with different pieces of leather and there's no way to blend, there's very few ways to bring in any degrees of light and shadow. You've just got this piece of leather and this piece of leather right next to it. And stitching is the way that you add what little bit of light and shadow and movement that you can. Did you have a question?
Yeah, why butterflies and flower?
That's a good question. It's been historical for, I can't go back and ask that question of cowboys 100 years ago, but I'm going to assume that it was because they were looking for nature for inspiration. And also because they fill in that space so well. And I don't really know if that tradition came from the bootmakers, what they wanted to inlay and overlay, or if it came from the cowboys requesting. I don't know the answer to that question. There's a lot of, as I said, no one's studied this. There's no history about cowboy boots. It's really an interesting question, how and why cowboy boots evolved the way they did. Because the original cowboys chasing the cattle up the trail were wearing leftover Civil War boots, and this was like in the 1880s, and then by 1890 they were already becoming romanticized, and Buffalo Bill was out doing his Wild West shows, and suddenly there was a demand for color and things that would show up since they didn't have cameras and big screens. And now you started to see the beginning of flowers and butterflies and color on the cowboy boots. But there's just so little that exists from that period. It's just kind of this leap, and no one knows when or why it happened. Here I am stitching. This, you see the presser foot looks sort of like a coin rolling on its side. That's called a roller wheel. It does roll as it stitches. And if you're going to do any sort of decorative work, you must have a machine with a roller wheel. It's simply not optional, because it gives you this huge field of vision, and you can see that edge. If you had a typical roller wheel with a needle in the middle, you can't see your leather edge or the previous row of stitching or whatever it is you're guiding off of. It just rolls along like a coin on its side. It only sews in one direction, so the work rotates. That's the reason I'm raising the lift all the time to change direction. Now we're just into machine porn. Isn't it beautiful? I love sewing machines. I love being around people who appreciate sewing machines. This is a leather-specific model. It's not produced anymore. The machine I prefer is a Singer 110W, either a 125 or a 124. I think the one I have now is a 124, but I can't tell the 124 and the 125 apart. I like this one because it not only has the roller foot, the feed, instead of feed dogs, the feed is a roller wheel. You get a very smooth feed. And the Singer 110W is the only one with that roller feed. Some bootmakers prefer the Singer 3115 because it has an infinite stitch length from 0 to big. But It has feed dogs. And I'm using a size 11 needle here. So this is no bigger than a home sewing machine needle. And this one still has the old clutch motor on it. It's noisy, and you really have to have control. It's sort of like driving a stick shift. Once you can drive a stick shift, you can drive anything. Same with the clutch motor. Okay, now we're going to continue how a boot goes together. The boot tops are just flat, and they make a gentle curve, and then you've got a boot top, and the same with the heel, just a gentle curve, flat piece of leather. But the foot part, called a vamp, has to become a completely three-dimensional shape. Here I'm stretching it over this board called a crimp board. This process is called crimping, and I'm beginning to give what was formerly a flat piece of leather a totally three-dimensional foot shape. This is done while it's wet, so it will be less likely to tear. The point of stress, you can't see it, the point of stress is in that curve.
How long do you leave it in tension?
Until it's completely dry. It depends on the weather. Usually 3 days, maybe.
So you never kiln or oven dry anything?
No.
So,
Old bootmakers sometimes would have a hot box, which is just a big wooden box with a very light heat source at one end and a fan at the other end. But I'm never in that big of a hurry. Okay, so now I've sewn the foot part, the vamp, onto the front panels, and I've sewed the heel part, which is called the counter and the counter cover, onto the back panels. And now I'm going to stitch the side seams. They're stitched right sides together on this beautiful old machine called a straight needle. The leather is heavy enough here that the straight needle has an awl that comes down and punches the hole, and then a little straight needle that looks kind of like a crochet hook comes up and grabs the thread. That's how the stitch is made. This is the machine that attracted me to bootmaking. Jay had this machine. I never got to stitch on his, but when you sew on it, it goes ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And it's just the most beautiful sound. You can't buy them anymore new. I'm going to guess probably still around early 1940s. And they're just beautiful old machines. You can get other machines to do sides. That's all it does is my shop, is these side seams, nothing else. It's still worth it because it's just so fun. So now I've stitched the side seams and I'm getting ready to turn them. That's just, you literally are pushing the boot down in until you can grab the other end and pull it through. Sometimes they fight back. This boot has been turned. And there's a turned boot with the last. Now I've put the boost on the last. And I wet the foot leather so that it will be less likely to tear while I'm stretching it around. There are specialized tools for this, just like with special pliers. There's a toe. You'll notice that most footwear, the toe is harder so that it doesn't flatten and lose its shape, and it also provides a little protection. So that is called the toe box, or if you're English, it's called the toe puff. And that's been placed in there so that that toe will keep that shape. And this is mostly bragging. I've only ever done a double row of sole stitching once or twice. I don't like it. I don't think it's attractive, but look at that. I did it. So again, that's another large machine like the straight needle, but the curved needle has a curved awl that comes up and punches the hole, and then a curved needle that comes down and grabs the thread. What that means is you're stitching upside down. You can't see where you're going, and there's a blade that cuts a channel in the sole leather so that your stitches will fall down in that channel, and then you're not walking on open stitches. If you tilt it all, your stitches come out of the channel. It's a terrifying machine, and you've already spent hours on this boot, and you can just ruin it at the curved needle. You know, the shoe repair people are so good on a curved needle because they just do it all the time. But as a Cowboy bootmaker, I'm making fewer boots now, but I used to make 3 to 4 pairs of boots a month. Yeah. Imagine how long it takes to get good on a machine when you only use it 3 to 4 times a month, and there's no way to practice. The only way that machine works as designed is on a boot or a shoe. It's terrifying. When you're wearing a cowboy boot and you look down and you see stitching going around the toe, or the stitching that we just saw a minute ago, that's not on the top of the sole. There's a narrow strip of leather called the welt, and the welt is hand sewn through the insole, through the boot, through the welt. And that's a hand stitch. I've got a long piece of thread that tapers down very thin to a bristle on each end, and I feed one through the hole this way and one through the hole this way, and pull it through, and then wrap one end around the awl and one end around my hand and pull it tight. And that's what gives me forearms like this. And that's the foundation of the boot, because now I'm going to put the sole on and do that sole stitching, but the welt stitching is just the foundation between the top and the bottom. And then down there where I'll pause. Down here where you see the lacing that looks kind of like a corset or something, there I've laced the shank area of the boot to the insole. And that strip down the middle is where I'll insert the metal shank. So here's an inseamed boot. Ideally you want it to look like this, very flat and not wiggles. Here's the progression. The one on the left, that's the metal shank that you can see. And then in the middle, I've covered it with a strip of leather. And then on the right, it's been laced firmly into place. And the sole is glued on. And actually, with today's glues, you could probably just glue that sole on and keep going. You wouldn't have to stitch it or peg it. But it's traditional. And originally, these things were very necessary. So these are little wooden pegs. Traditionally, a cowboy boot has a pegged sole. It's only stitched from right behind the ball to right behind the ball. And then the shank in the heel is pegged. These are wooden pegs. They look like small broken off toothpicks. And I drive a hole in the damp sole leather and then drive the peg in. It requires one quick sharp blow. If you try to tap it, you'll get a little ways in and then it'll break. And this boot has the double row of pegs. And those are my tools. That little hammer, I'm so proud of that. That's a double-aught hammer. It's beautiful and perfect. You want a small rounded hammer face for pegging, because if you used a large hammer with a flat face and corners, then when you drove that peg in, you would make marks in your wet sole leather. Now I've finished the sole and I'm going to start adding the heel. Go ahead.
I'm just curious, the pegs are going into the insole?
The pegs are going through the sole, through those fillers, and through the insole and just barely piercing the top of the insole. If you drive your pegs in too deeply, they'll go into the last, and then you can't get the last out, and that is no fun at all, because I have been there.
A, what kind of wood are the pegs, and then B, is that something you have to make yourself, or is that something that you purchase from a supplier?
I can buy them. The pegs that I use and sell are made in Germany, and they say they're Lemonwood pegs, but no one knows what Lemonwood is, and basically they're birch. There used to be a peg company in the U.S., Kearsarge Peg Company, and they were still using machinery to make the pegs from the Civil War, and it burned. And that machine, you can't get that machine anymore. And even more interesting, there's a description in Laura Ingalls Wilder's Farmer Boy, and there's a description of the cobbler who came around to fix people's shoes and how there's a description of him making the pegs, like cutting the strip of leather and, wood and chopping them off. So worst comes to worst, I'm going to read that book. Okay, so I've finished the sole. I've made it all shiny and smooth. It takes a lot longer than that short sentence I just said. And now I'm ready to add the heel. A lot of people think the heel is a wooden block. It is not. It's the same leather as the sole, one layer at a time. So I'll put a layer on, I'll level it, another layer, level it. These look kind of funky and off balance because they don't have enough layers yet. And now I'm beginning to get to where it's leveled. And this is actually one of the hardest skills to teach, is learning to level heels. And that's that Patriotic boot. And there's some heels. You will notice that cowboy boots come in pairs, which means that every time you do something wonderful and perfect, you have to turn around and do it again. Opposite. Now I'm just going to show you some pretty pictures of boots. You will notice that all of the boots I make are commissioned. They're all for an individual client. And sometimes those clients choose from my portfolio, and sometimes they bring their own ideas. This particular order was for a hand doctor. And the inspiration for this was he sent me pictures of petroglyphs, and I named all of my boots after bluegrass and classic country songs. And I named this one On the Other Hand. I'm so proud of that.
So what's the skin on that? Is that eel or is that?
It's alligator.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is an unusual construction. This is called a triad because triad basically refers to it has 3 pieces. There is a heel part on the back, but it's decorative. This boot basically has 3 pieces, which is the back panel, the front panel, and then the partial foot part. So the tops go all the way to the sole. And that way, when he's sitting like this and his pants come up just a little bit, you can get a glimpse of something going on those boots. Sometimes my customers ask me to do things that I don't particularly consider wise. This is the horse from Fantasia, and I don't consider that to be a traditional cowboy theme. But it did turn out pretty cool, and I especially liked the way he wanted the boot tongue to become the horse head. That's my favorite part of that boot. Sometimes people assume that cowboy boots, because they're colorful and flowery, that they're for women. This is a man's boot. There are no gender lines or gender distinctions in cowboy boots. I tell my customers that cowboy boots are a way for men to wear high heels and bright colors. So if you, as a man, if you wish to wear stiletto red heels, I fully support you. But if you want to do something a little less colorful, you can always do cowboy boots. Another thing I tell my customers, people will say, what's the point of all this work? It's hidden under your pants. And I tell them that the art on cowboy boots is like lingerie. You know it's there and you feel pretty, but not everyone gets to see it. This is the first original design that I ever did, so I'm somewhat proud of that. And these roses, if you look closely, you'll see that they have some definition. You do that by taking a thin and kind of soft piece of leather and you just twist it and grab it up and make a bundle of it. And that's how you create the rose petal effect. The hard part is going from that twist of leather to perfectly smooth out along the edges, because you don't want clumps of leather anywhere other but within the rose.
So you're using the linear quality of the thread to define the line, and there's no leather in the thin part.
Yes, occasionally, like the top of that stem is only thread. Thread the stitching is such an important part of leather inlay and overlay. Not only does it hold it in place, it gives it all that final detail. Patriotic boots again. If you Google the words Arnold Schwarzenegger and ridiculously patriotic boots, you'll see Arnold wearing these boots. I don't know why they were judged to be ridiculously patriotic, but they were. Those are really fun. And I'll point out one thing about these. With most designs, it's not always possible. And I will admit I got lost a few times on this design. But it should be possible to start here and go up and go all the way around and do all of this and come back to here. The only exception to that is here I've stitched E pluribus unum, and obviously I had to stop and start there. But the rest of it, if I was paying attention, I was able to come right back where I started. Sometimes I get lost on something that complex.
How many hours were those? How many months?
There's an average, not a boot like that, but there's an average of about 40 hours in a plain pair of boots. And then for the boot top, it depends, but one like that, probably 4 or 5 days to create those boot tops. But that assumes that I'm sitting down and working continuously. Even with that 40 hours, there's lots of wet, dry time. It's more efficient to work on 2 or 3 pairs and leapfrog. And now with my supply business, there are days when I go in intending to work on boots and instead my website crashes and I spent all day doing that. It's kind of made my schedule more interesting. Yes. I like this design because of the flowers on the side seam. That's a challenge because you have half a flower on this side and half a flower here, and obviously you want them to meet like this and not like this. This design, if you notice, there's no side seam. This is a one-piece top. There's only one seam up the back, and that makes it easier to, in some places it's easier to work with that, but then once you're sewing the foot part on, you have to sew that back seam before you can complete the foot part. You reach a point where you're trying to sew stuff onto a tube, and then it gets really tricky. These are called Kansas City Star. Again, I named them all after bluegrass and classic country songs. And Kansas City Star is a song by Roger Miller. And I love this song because it's about a man who has a good job in Kansas City. He's offered a better job in Omaha. But he decides to stay in Kansas City because everyone loves him in Kansas City. And I think that's a valid reason for staying in your town. And again, this has a design that's half is on one side and half is on the other, and you have to make sure they meet. In fact, it has multiple things meeting in the middle there.
So do they tell you what kind of toe they want?
Well, these are for my husband, so he doesn't get to tell me anything.
Oh, okay.
I just make whatever I feel like making that day.
No, okay.
If you ask him what he does for a living, he will tell you he's a boot model. I often make, if I'm going to go to a competition, he often gets my competition boots. I wear a ladies size 6, and like that Patriotic boot, I literally couldn't make that for myself because I'd have to scale it down far enough that I don't think it would be possible. He gets a lot of the competition boots just because he's bigger, which isn't fair. I'm particularly proud of this pair of boots, and I'm going to share with you why. If you watch the Craft in America program, you might remember that I had a daughter who made shoes with me, and she died in 2017. It was obviously a devastating loss, and it took me a long time to really get back into the shop because I was so used to having her there and working with her and having her be my student. And after that, I realized that I had the choice of being small and sad forever or opening myself up to joy. And it would be a conscious decision forever now. And so I began thinking about the boots that I wanted to make. And I gave this pair of boots to a musician. And the only thing he told me was, I want the bird because his new album was called Mockingbird. And he said, I want purple tops. So I was designing something new for him, and I had this idea that I wanted it to look like stained glass. So I came up with the design, but I was worried that on this purple top, if I just stitched black stitching across to represent the lead, that it would just look like random black stitching on the purple, and it wouldn't really translate as the lead in the way that I wanted. So I was driving home one night, and I had these kind of simultaneous visions. I saw this boot, and I realized what I needed to do on that purple, the dark purple leather, was fill it in with lavender thread. So that's what I've done. Each of those divisions, I've gone around and around and around and around and around until it's full, and done that with each one. And that's how I tried to convey the sense of light coming through the glass. But I also had a vision of myself like a bird that hadn't flown for a long time, stretching its wings and flexing wings that were muscular but hadn't been used in a while. And that's how I felt about this design, like I was coming back to life. And so this is a very meaningful design to me, even though I don't own these boots, but I love this design, and it speaks to me, and I'm proud that I've continued to search for joy.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Is there some way to mark the boots that they made by you? So it's like your trademark?
Yes. I don't have a photo of it, but inside the back panels, there's a reinforcement, like a little stiffener inside the front panels, and that's sandwiched between the lining and the boot. You don't see it. But on the back, it's actually stitched on the outside on the lining. And it has two purposes. It helps the boot stand up, and it's also this slick, shiny leather so that when you put your heel in, it has something to slide against. And in that back reinforcement, I stitched my initials, LS. I've done various versions of it over the year. It's currently just an L and an S, but I stitched that in because there are so many vintage boots that say maker unknown. And I decided you might say, I hate her boots, but you won't ever say, I don't know who made those boots. This was an interesting boot I did. Had this vision of trying to do an Old West town, and each of the buildings has the building name stitched in. There's a livery and there's a sheriff. And when I was working, the lettering is so small, I just had to freehand it. And my son was watching me work, and he said, well, on the saloon, if you run out of room, you can make it a salon, and it can be a very well-groomed Western town. But fortunately, we got a saloon.
So you didn't sew all those names on your machine, you did it by hand?
Oh, when I say by hand, I just mean I drew it on, and then with the machine, I'm just stitch by stitch, yeah. And it's still kind of scary because at that scale, maybe the V takes up more space in practice than you thought it would, and then you run out of room. The interesting, scary thing about working with leather is when you stitch something, it leaves a hole. It's not like fabric where you can take the thread out and start over. Once you've stitched it, it's there. I love this pair of boots. It's so pretty. The horses, you notice that they're different colors because these represent her actual horses. I wouldn't do zippers for just any client, but I do have two clients that have a prosthetic foot, and they require a zipper in that one boot. And one of the clients, he's such a nice man, and he told me he was raised in Oklahoma. He always wanted cowboy boots, but if you take a pair of boots to a shoe repair shop, what they're going to do is just cut out the side seam and put in a zipper, and it's very exposed. And he said he was never willing to do that because it was just too obviously, look at me, I have a prosthetic foot, here's a zipper. And so I made him a pair of boots where there's a flap that extends over the side seam, and in that flap I put a fake side seam and a fake pull. So unless you look closely, it just looks like a regular boot and the zipper is hidden underneath. I made the belt strip. I'm not a belt maker, and what I did is I made the belt strip and then I sent it to a real belt maker, and he made it a belt.
How often have you done that, to have a matching boot?
Not that often. You know, I could probably sell more belts if I remembered, but I'm just not interested in belts. So you have to remember to say, I want a matching belt, instead of me being responsible and saying, would you like a matching belt? This is a fun little pair of boots. Again, with the flower on the side seam. I like that challenge. And this lady was so sweet. I have good customers. This is an alligator foot. These were called turning to the light because that's what sunflowers do. These boots were for an artist, and we traded for a piece of art, which is one of my favorite things to do because then I get beautiful art that I couldn't otherwise afford. I couldn't afford my own boots either.
Can I have a question?
This is one of the ways that I've been expanding into joy and into doing what I want. This is a pair of shoes built on a cowboy boot last. In the 1940s, during the war, leather was scarce, and if you've ever heard the term pee-wees for very short boots, those were developed during the war because it was a way to use less leather. And there was a company called Olson Stelzer who made shoes on cowboy boot lasts. And I think they're so cool. And so now I'm playing with, it's a totally different shape for me to play with. Can I inlay in there? How much can I do? The shape is different. And this is also the first piece of art I've created that's specifically about the death of my daughter. So I'm pleased with these shoes. Thank you. This is another way I'm exploring moving forward. And this is something new that I have done. I'm working on a pair of boots now. The boot tops are actually in the back. If you want to see and touch boot tops, these are in the back. I've made a pair of boots that there was a country music duo called the Louvin Brothers in the 1950s. I love this old country music. They did gospel music and they did some hardcore gospel, and their most iconic album was called Satan is Real. And it's quite an album cover. I've done that in the back, and then I got this idea to do a portrait of the Louvin Brothers. And when I got the idea, I honestly didn't know if doing portraits was possible with leather inlay and overlay. There's no painting here. This is all inlay, overlay, and stitching. Doing eyes was hard, but I successfully did it, and now I'm going to do these boots. And another way that I'm moving in different directions, I'm going to donate these boots to an organization to be raffled. It is very important to me that these Satan is Real Louvin Brothers boots go to someone who loves the Louvin Brothers as much as I do. And I don't want to auction them because I don't want them to go to the highest bidder / richest person. I want people who love the Louvin Brothers to have an opportunity to own these boots. And I haven't really talked to an organization yet, but I think they're going to go to IBMA, which is the International Bluegrass Music Association, because I'd planned to raffle them myself, but then I learned that private individuals are not allowed by law to do raffles, so I had to think quickly. And again, here's my information if you would like to follow me online. And do we have any more questions? The best way to learn is from a person. I have an 8 DVD box set, which is my entire class on DVD. I don't teach bootmaking in my studio anymore because the only format that really works in today's society is a 2-week class. And a 2-week class has an inherent lie in it, which is after 2 weeks you'll be a bootmaker. You won't be. You need as much time as you can spend with a bootmaker, the better. I wish I could give you more encouraging information, but you need to be with a bootmaker. You know, you can take a 2-week class, you can buy the video, but you still need to go be with a bootmaker as often as possible.
You make the last?
I don't make the last. I buy the last from a factory in Mexico, but then I and any other bootmaker will customize the last. So I might choose a size 8B for you, but then if you have a bunion or a high-end step, I'll customize it for your foot.
Whose shoes boots besides your own do you admire?
There's a bootmaker in Texas named Greg Carmack. Greg Carmack knows more about bootmaking and shoemaking than anyone I know. Wes Shugart, who's in the exhibit at the Otis College, the Ben Maltz Gallery. Wes is a fantastic bootmaker and a good friend. Lee Miller in Austin is a fantastic bootmaker. I admire lots of bootmakers. I've always said if I could get every single bootmaker to tell me everything they know, I'd know the most. It is very labor intensive. My goal now is to buy myself one of those little 2-person saunas because I really need one. I try to do yoga and exercise, but the fact that I'm a woman, when I got into this craft, I think there were 3 other women bootmakers. It was rare and I was kind of patronized sometimes, but now, most of my students, when I was teaching, most of my students are female. The other bootmakers who are teaching, the majority of students are female. It's interesting that this has been a male-dominated craft. In 20 years, it's going to be a female-dominated craft.
And do you have a firm handshake?
I do, but I have to say that I'm afraid it's going to give me arthritis, and that's affecting my grip. But I'll keep making boots as long as I can. Was there another question? Yes?
Yeah, in stretching the boot, or is there a way also to shrink a boot after it's made?
Theoretically, but once it's been stretched, it's tricky to get it to stay. You know, you can wet it and heat it up and hope it shrinks a little, but
And do
it
you
probably
only
won't
use
stay.
water to stretch it before you?
I use 3 parts water, 1 part alcohol, and a drop of dishwashing liquid.
Can you lower the heel on the boots that come?
No. It's something you want to be very careful with. Sometimes factory boots are made on the wrong last, and so they have the wrong heel height in the first place. But every last has a recommended heel height, and you don't want to mess with that. There's heel height and toe spring. So toe spring is how much the toe pops up. So if you lower the heel, then suddenly you've got elf toes. And if you make the heel higher, you're going to lose your toe spring, and then it won't walk properly, and you're digging your toes in. So no, I don't recommend it. I have made children's boots, but they outgrow them so quickly that it's just sort of a fun thing. I had an old bootmaker tell me I wouldn't know what I was doing until I'd made at least 500 pairs of boots. He was correct. That took me about 10 years, and after that I stopped counting.